Have you ever wondered why both Lucifer and vampires share such striking similarities? The Prince of Darkness and the immortal blood drinkers, is this merely coincidence or something far more sinister? What if I told you the connection between Lucifer and vampires goes deeper than most biblical scholars and horror enthusiasts have ever dared to explore? The Bible tells us in Isaiah 14:1-20, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations." This description of Lucifer's fall mirrors the vampire's exile from the light, both cast out, both transformed, both hungry for something they've lost. Tonight, we're going to uncover the shocking connections between the fallen angel who challenged God and the undead creatures who challenged death itself. This isn't just another vampire documentary or biblical study. This is about exposing a spiritual reality that has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The ancient Hebrew texts refer to Lucifer as Country Dalalerdlith Hello, the Shining One, the light bearer who became the Prince of Darkness. Isn't it fascinating that vampires, too, were once beings of light, humans, before their transformation into creatures of shadow? The parallels are undeniable and deeply troubling. From ancient folklore to modern entertainment, from biblical prophecies to historical accounts of blood rituals, we're about to connect dots that will forever change how you view both Lucifer and the vampire legends. Are you ready to discover the truth? Because once you see these connections, you can never unsee them. Before we can understand the connection between Lucifer and vampires, we must first understand who or what Lucifer truly is. The name Lucifer appears only once in the King James Bible, in Isaiah 14:12, yet this singular mention has spawned centuries of theological debate and spiritual warfare. Lucifer was God's most beautiful creation, the morning star, the light bearer. Ezekiel 28:14 tells us, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you: ruby, topaz, and emerald, chrysolite, onyx and jasper, sapphire, turquoise and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you." But pride became his downfall. Lucifer wanted to be like God, not to serve, but to be served. Isaiah 14:13 reveals his 5 fatal declarations. "I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." Notice the repeated "I will," the ultimate declaration of pride and self-determination. This rebellion led to cosmic war. Revelation 12:7-9 describes, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray." Lucifer's fall transformed him from light bearer to Prince of Darkness. He became Satan, the adversary, the accuser of mankind. Yet he retained his beauty, his charisma, his ability to appear as an angel of light. As 2 Corinthians 1:14 warns us, and no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. This ability to seduce, to transform, to offer forbidden knowledge and power, these are the very attributes we see reflected in vampire mythology throughout history. The fallen angel who promised Eve in Genesis 3:5, "You will be like God," offers the same temptation that vampire legends present. Transcend your mortality, embrace darkness, and gain power beyond human limitations. But what if this similarity isn't coincidental? What if the vampire legends that have persisted across virtually every culture are actually echoes of a spiritual reality, reflections of Lucifer's own fall, and his continued corruption of humanity? The Hebrew sages speak of Lilith, the night creature who refused to submit to Adam and left Eden to become a drinker of blood. Is this ancient connection between fallen angels and blood, drinking immortals, merely folklore, or is it pointing to a deeper truth about spiritual rebellion? The vampire myth exists in virtually every culture throughout history. From the Chinese Jiangxi to the Greek Lamia, from the Indian Vitala to the Romanian Strigoi, across continents and millennia, humans have told stories of immortal beings who feed on blood and shun the light. But why? What is it about this particular mythological creature that resonates so deeply within the human psyche? The answer may lie in the spiritual blueprint established by Lucifer's original rebellion. Consider the core elements of vampire mythology. First, immortality. Vampires transcend death, the ultimate boundary God established for humanity after the fall. Genesis 3:19 states, "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return." Second, blood consumption. Vampires sustain their unnatural existence by consuming the life force of others. Leviticus 17:11 tells us, "For the life of a creature is in the blood." By drinking blood, vampires mock the sacrificial system God established and pervert the symbolism of Christ's sacrifice. Third, nocturnal existence. Vampires flee from sunlight, existing in darkness. John 3:9-20 explains, "Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil." Everyone who does evil hates the light, and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. Fourth, the power of transformation. Vampires can often change form, appearing beautiful and seductive one moment, monstrous the next. This mirrors Lucifer's ability to appear as an angel of light while harboring darkness within. Fifth, the method of reproduction. Vampires create more of their kind through a perversion of communion, a dark baptism of blood that transforms the victim into the very thing that attacked them. This unholy conversion process mimics but perverts spiritual rebirth. The ancient text of Enoch, though not canonical, speaks of the Nephilim, offspring of fallen angels, and humans who developed an insatiable thirst for blood. The book of Enoch 7:4-5 describes, "And they began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood." Archaeological discoveries at sites like Göbekli Tepe reveal evidence of blood rituals dating back over 11,000 years. Ancient pottery depicts beings with elongated teeth consuming blood from human victims. Were our ancestors trying to document encounters with actual vampiric entities, or were they symbolically representing the spiritual predation they experienced? The vampire, in essence, embodies everything Lucifer promised in the garden: godlike immortality, transcendence of natural law, power over others, and freedom from divine judgment. Yet, like Lucifer's promises, the vampire's existence is a cursed one, immortal yet damned, powerful yet bound by limitations, alive yet fundamentally dead. But what if these similarities aren't merely symbolic? What if there's a direct spiritual lineage between Lucifer's rebellion and the vampire legends that haunt our collective consciousness? Can you handle what comes next? Because we're about to explore evidence that suggests Lucifer may be more than just symbolically connected to vampires. He may be their spiritual progenitor. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes the significance of blood covenants. Hebrews 9:2 states, "Without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness." God established blood as the currency of spiritual transactions, a principle Lucifer has perverted throughout history. When God made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, animals were sacrificed and their blood was shed. When Moses established the covenant at Sinai in Exodus 24:8, he took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you." And when Jesus established the new covenant, he said in Matthew 26:28, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Blood carries spiritual power, a concept Lucifer understands all too well. Throughout history, cultures that turned to Satan worship invariably turned to blood rituals. The ancient Canaanites sacrificed children to Molech. The Aztecs cut out beating hearts for their gods. Even today, certain occult practices involve blood offerings. The Hebrew word for blood, jusistam, appears 360 times in the Old Testament. The spiritual significance of blood cannot be overstated. It represents life itself, the very essence of existence. By controlling blood, one symbolically controls life and death. Vampirism, at its core, is a perversion of God's blood covenant system. Instead of blood being shed as sacrifice, it is consumed for self-preservation. Instead of blood establishing communion with God, it creates unholy communion with darkness. Instead of blood bringing forgiveness, vampire blood brings damnation. The vampire's bite creates a blood bond between predator and prey, a dark covenant that transforms the victim. This mirrors how Lucifer operates spiritually, creating blood bonds with those who surrender to his influence. As John 8:44 says of Satan, "He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him." Archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamia shows clay tablets depicting rituals where priests drank blood to commune with entities they believed existed beyond death. In the ruins of Babylon, inscriptions describe beings who could only walk at night and required blood to maintain their existence. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of texts describing the Watchers who taught humans forbidden knowledge and created offspring that consumed blood. The connection between fallen angels and blood consumption appears repeatedly in ancient texts from diverse cultures. Modern science has even discovered fascinating parallels. Recent DNA studies have identified a rare genetic disorder called porphyria, which causes extreme sensitivity to sunlight and receding gums that make teeth appear longer. It also involves an inability to properly process iron, requiring regular blood transfusions. Some historians believe this condition may have contributed to vampire legends. But what if the causality runs in the opposite direction? What if these genetic anomalies are not the source of vampire myths, but rather the physical manifestation of spiritual corruption that began with Lucifer's rebellion? What if certain bloodlines carry the spiritual markers of ancient blood covenants made with dark powers? Revelation 16:3 describes a future judgment where waters turn to blood like that of a dead person. The Greek word used for dead person is nekros, the same root word that gives us necromancy, the forbidden practice of communicating with the dead. Is this coincidental, or is God highlighting the connection between blood corruption and death magic, the very essence of vampirism? The spiritual DNA connection between Lucifer and vampires becomes clearer when we examine how both operate. Both offer immortality at the cost of one's soul. Both require blood to seal their covenants. Both transform their victims into their own image, and both exist in opposition to divine light. But the evidence goes deeper still. Are you prepared to see how this connection manifests in our world today? Because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about spiritual warfare in the modern age. The vampire archetype has exploded in popularity over the past century. From Bram Stoker's Dracula to Twilight, from True Blood to the Vampire Diaries, our culture is saturated with vampire imagery. But why this obsession? Why has the vampire become one of the most recognizable and romanticized figures in modern entertainment? Ecclesiastes 1:9 tells us, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." The current vampire obsession isn't new. It's the modern manifestation of an ancient spiritual pattern. Today's entertainment industry has transformed the vampire from a repulsive predator into a misunderstood anti-hero. The vampire is now portrayed as beautiful, tormented, powerful, and desirable, exactly how Lucifer presents himself. This is no coincidence. By romanticizing the vampire, popular culture normalizes the very spiritual corruption Lucifer has promoted since Eden. The vampire's appeal lies in its promise of freedom from moral constraints. Modern vampires in film and literature often struggle with their nature, but ultimately embrace it, finding power in accepting their darkness. This narrative mirrors Lucifer's own rebellion, the rejection of divine authority in favor of self-determination. Consider how modern vampire stories typically portray religious symbols. Crosses holy water and sacred ground repel vampires, yet these stories rarely acknowledge the god behind these symbols. The spiritual is acknowledged only as a force, not as a personal deity requiring obedience. This subtle distinction reflects Lucifer's own approach, acknowledging spiritual power while rejecting divine authority. The Hebrew concept of stayuriness, yas tuma, ritual impurity, provides insight here. In biblical law, contact with death created tuma, requiring purification. Vampires exist in a state of permanent tuma, undead beings who spread spiritual corruption through physical contact. Their inability to enter a dwelling without invitation reflects the spiritual principle that darkness cannot enter unless welcomed. Beyond entertainment, vampire symbolism has infiltrated modern spirituality. Blood rituals, once hidden in obscure occult circles, have entered mainstream consciousness through vampire-themed clubs, blood-drinking communities, and vampire spiritual movements. Medical reports document cases of individuals with clinical vampirism or Renfield syndrome, a psychiatric condition involving the compulsion to drink blood. While psychology offers materialistic explanations, the spiritual dimension remains unexplored by secular science. The fashion industry embraces vampire aesthetics through vampire facials, using blood, jewelry featuring fangs and blood vials, and clothing lines inspired by vampire imagery. Major corporations incorporate subtle vampire symbolism in logos and advertising, the serpent devouring itself, the blood red symbolism, the predatory messaging. Even our language reflects this influence. We speak of corporate vampires, energy vampires, and vampire capitalism, intuitively recognizing the spiritual pattern of parasitic consumption. The political realm isn't immune either. Leaders throughout history have been described as bloodsuckers who drain the life force of nations. Some political movements explicitly use blood symbolism and sacrificial language that echoes ancient vampire cults. Revelation 17:6 describes a system that becomes drunk with the blood of God's holy people. John's vision reveals a global structure that sustains itself by consuming the spiritual life force of others, a vampiric system on a worldwide scale. The connection between Lucifer and vampires manifests today, not just in entertainment, but in how power operates, how resources are consumed, and how spiritual energy is harvested from unsuspecting populations. But here's the question that should trouble us most. If Lucifer's spiritual DNA expresses itself through vampire-like systems and behaviors, are we unwittingly participating in these systems? Are we, in some sense, feeding the very spiritual vampirism that Lucifer established? What if the greatest trick wasn't convincing the world he doesn't exist, but convincing the world to embrace his nature, while thinking they're merely enjoying harmless entertainment? The evidence mounts, but we've only scratched the surface. Are you ready to go deeper into the historical records that document this connection? Because what ancient texts reveal about Lucifer and blood rituals will shake you to your core. The connection between Lucifer and vampiric entities appears in texts far older than Bram Stoker's Dracula. Ancient manuscripts from diverse cultures contain startling parallels, that suggest a common spiritual source behind vampire legends worldwide. The Book of Enoch, though not included in most biblical canons, was quoted by Jude and referenced by Peter in the New Testament. Enoch 7:1-5 describes fallen angels who taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they began to sin against birds, and beasts, and reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. This ancient text explicitly connects fallen angels, Lucifer's cohort, with the introduction of blood consumption as a spiritual practice. The Nephilim, offspring of these fallen angels, are described as giants who terrorized humanity and developed an insatiable thirst for blood. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of the War Scroll describing battles between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The latter were characterized by blood rituals and nocturnal activities, using the Hebrew term Sanctazratix, Layla night, repeatedly. In Mesopotamian texts, we find accounts of the Akimu, restless spirits who could not enter the underworld, and instead preyed on the living by drinking their blood. The Babylonian Talmud mentions Lilin, night demons descended from Lilith who were said to drink blood and attack sleeping humans. Egyptian hieroglyphs depict entities called the drinkers of the red who could only be repelled by specific amulets and rituals involving garlic and certain woods. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of the Nuri, a tribe he claimed could transform into wolves for several days each year, an early reference to shape-shifting. The Greek Lamia and Impusa were female entities who seduced men and drank their blood, again connecting seduction, transformation, and blood consumption. In China, the Jiangshi or hopping vampire appears in texts dating back to the Qin dynasty. These reanimated corpses were said to absorb the Qi life energy of the living, often through blood. They could only move at night and were repelled by items that modern vampire lore would later incorporate. The Aztec goddess Tlazolteotl required blood sacrifice and was associated with both sexuality and nocturnal activities. Spanish conquistadors recorded rituals involving blood drinking that they associated with demonic worship, yet another cultural connection between blood consumption and spiritual darkness. The Norse Draugr were undead beings who guarded their burial treasures and could drain life from the living. They could only be destroyed by specific methods, including decapitation and burning methods that would become standard in later vampire folklore. What's remarkable is not just the existence of these parallels, but their consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. How did civilizations separated by vast oceans and thousands of years develop nearly identical concepts of blood, drinking immortals who shunned the light? The biblical answer may lie in Genesis 11, with the Tower of Babel. When God confused human language and scattered people across the earth, they carried with them fragmented memories of spiritual truths. These included knowledge of Lucifer's rebellion and its consequences, which, distorted over time, manifested as vampire legends adapted to local cultural contexts. Romans 21:23 explains how humanity, having rejected God's truth, created distorted spiritual understandings. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. This spiritual principle explains why vampire legends contain elements of truth, immortality, blood's spiritual significance, light versus darkness, wrapped in cultural distortions. The core spiritual reality of Lucifer's rebellion and his offer of forbidden knowledge remains consistent beneath the varied expressions. Archaeological discoveries continue to unearth evidence supporting this connection. Recent excavations in Bulgaria uncovered skeletons with iron stakes driven through their hearts, dating back to the 13th century. Similar burial practices have been found across Eastern Europe, with corpses decapitated, staked, or weighed down with stones, precautions against the undead rising. But perhaps most compelling are the ancient texts describing blood covenants with dark entities, covenants that granted power, knowledge, or extended life in exchange for loyalty and sacrifice. These accounts appear in Sumerian clay tablets, Egyptian papyri, and obscure rabbinical commentaries alike. The Midrash, ancient Jewish commentary on the Torah, contains references to beings called Yolju Yus Matzetzi Dam, literally bloodsuckers. They made covenants with humans seeking forbidden knowledge and could only be repelled by mezuzah, the scripture containing doorpost markers that observant Jews still use today. What if these weren't merely superstitions, but documentation of actual spiritual transactions? What if Lucifer, having established the pattern of blood covenants for spiritual power, manifested this pattern through various entities across human history? The Book of Revelation gives us a glimpse of this spiritual reality. Revelation 16:3-14 describes, "Then I saw 3 impure spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet." They are demonic spirits that perform signs. These entities, emerging from the dragon, semi-identified as Satan in Revelation 12:9, perform supernatural acts to deceive humanity. The ancient Hebrew concept of perverted, often translated simply as demons, appears in Deuteronomy 3:2-17. They sacrifice to demons, which are not God. Gods they had not known, gods that recently appeared, gods your ancestors did not fear. The root word frank, shed, connects to devastation and destruction, spiritual entities that consume rather than create, much like the vampire archetype. What lies buried in these ancient texts is a consistent spiritual pattern, entities aligned with Lucifer who offer power through blood covenants. They operate in darkness, consume life rather than generate it, and transform their victims into their own image. Can you see how this pattern has persisted through history, adapting to each culture while maintaining its essential spiritual DNA? The connection between Lucifer and vampiric entities isn't merely symbolic. It's foundational to understanding how spiritual corruption operates across time and culture. To truly understand the connection between Lucifer and vampires, we must examine the spiritual mechanics at work. How exactly does vampirism function on a spiritual level, and how does this reflect Lucifer's own methods? First, consider the concept of spiritual authority. In Genesis, God gave humanity dominion over the earth. This authority can be surrendered or transferred through covenant relationships. Jesus referenced this principle in Luke 4:6 when Satan tempted him with worldly authority, claiming, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to." Vampirism operates on this same principle of transferred authority. The vampire cannot enter a dwelling without invitation, a spiritual law reflecting that darkness cannot claim authority without consent. Once invited, however, the vampire gains access not just to the dwelling, but to the life within it. This mirrors how Lucifer operates. He cannot take what is not surrendered to him. Second, examine the transformation process. Vampire legends consistently describe a death and resurrection pattern. The victim dies to their human nature and is reborn as something else. This dark mirror of spiritual rebirth perverts the biblical concept found in 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here. The Hebrew concept of egonzavhis, etevela, ritual immersion, involved complete submersion in water symbolizing death to an old state and rebirth into a new one. Vampiric transformation perverts this through immersion in blood rather than water, death to light rather than sin, and rebirth into darkness rather than redemption. Third, consider the immortality aspect. Genesis 3:22 reveals God's concern after the fall. The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever. God prevented corrupted humanity from achieving physical immortality. Vampirism offers a counterfeit immortality, endless existence without true life, extension without redemption, continuation without purpose. This reflects Lucifer's own state, existing perpetually, but separated from the source of life, powerful, but ultimately damned. Fourth, examine the consumption element. John 6:53 records Jesus saying, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day." This spiritual communion with Christ brings life. Vampirism inverts this completely. Consuming blood brings not life, but undeath. Not communion with God, but separation from him. Not salvation, but damnation. The vampire consumes others to sustain itself, reflecting Lucifer's parasitic spiritual nature. Fifth, consider the light-darkness dichotomy. 1 John 1:25 tells us God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Light in Scripture consistently represents truth, holiness, and God's presence. Darkness represents deception, sin, and separation from God. Vampires cannot endure light. It weakens or destroys them. This spiritual principle reflects Lucifer's own relationship with divine light. As Isaiah 14:12 describes, he was cast out of heaven's light. John 3:20 explains, Everyone who does evil hates the light, and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. The spiritual mechanics of vampirism align perfectly with Lucifer's methods, offering counterfeit immortality, requiring blood covenants, operating in darkness, consuming rather than creating, and transforming victims into his own image. But perhaps most revealing is the vampire's relationship with symbols of faith. In vampire lore, crosses, holy water, and sacred ground repel vampires not because of their physical properties, but because of what they represent spiritually. The power isn't in the object, but in the authority it represents. This principle appears in Acts 19:15, where an evil spirit confronts unauthorized exorcists. "Jesus I know, and Paul I know about, but who are you?" Spiritual authority matters. The vampire's aversion to holy symbols reflects Lucifer's recognition of and rebellion against divine authority. Modern science offers interesting parallels to these spiritual mechanics. Parasitic organisms that take control of their hosts, altering their behavior to serve the parasite's reproduction, exist throughout nature. Certain fungi can infect insects, controlling their movements until the host positions itself ideally for the fungus to spread its spores. Some parasites can even alter their host's attraction responses, causing them to be drawn to predators that will consume them and continue the parasite's life cycle. These biological realities reflect spiritual principles. Lucifer operates as the ultimate spiritual parasite, altering his hosts to serve his purposes. He changes their attractions and aversions, using them to spread his influence before discarding them. The vampire, then, is not merely a fictional monster, but a spiritual archetype revealing how Lucifer operates. By understanding the spiritual mechanics of vampirism, we gain insight into the methods of our adversary, and more importantly, how to resist them. James 4:7 provides the answer: "Submit yourselves, then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Just as vampires flee from light, Lucifer flees from those who stand in God's authority. The spiritual mechanics work both ways. Darkness cannot overcome light unless light surrenders its position. What if the vampire legends that have fascinated humanity for centuries are actually God's way of revealing Lucifer's methods to us? What if these stories persist because they contain spiritual truths we need to understand? Are you beginning to see the connection more clearly now? But there's more to uncover. The modern manifestations of this ancient pattern will shock you to your core. The connection between Lucifer and vampirism extends beyond ancient texts and spiritual principles. It manifests in our world today through systems and structures that operate on vampiric principles. These modern manifestations aren't wearing capes or sleeping in coffins, but they follow the same spiritual pattern established by Lucifer. First, consider how power operates in our world. Jesus described righteous leadership in Matthew 10:7-26 to a tree. "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." By contrast, vampiric leadership consumes rather than serves. It extracts value without creating it. It maintains power by weakening others. This pattern appears in corrupt governments, exploitative corporations, and abusive religious systems alike, all spiritual descendants of Lucifer's approach to power.